Your company is the largest producer and exporter of chicken in Ukraine. Clearly disruptive events around the war in the country at this stage. Just spell out what's happening with the operations.
Well, look, at present we are on production budgets. Basically, you've got to remember that MHP produces up to 3 million tonnes of grain and up to 500,000 tonnes of sunflower oil. And this is what's really in the spotlight, more so than poultry. And frankly, at present, we have planted all our crops, as a lot of Ukrainian farmers have, and so far, so good. The season is running in our direction, but the biggest problem, as the central bank governor just mentioned, is all about logistics. The simple figures are this. We exported up to 60 to 70 million tonnes of grain last year. We have around about 20 to 25 million in stock from last year. We're going to be producing a winter crop soon, which probably about 35% lower than normal. And we have a summer crop coming up, which could approach around about 40 million tonnes. The biggest problem is that our logistics is about approximately 12 million tonnes a year using rail systems across the EU. So it is not only a crisis of logistics, it's a crisis of where you store the crops. This is a huge issue.
John, I think it's stunning too as we talk about just planting crops in what is a war-torn country now. Just give us a sense of how that plays out, how you have some sense of normality.
Well, look, basically, believe it or not, a lot of farmers were pretty much unaffected by the war in the western to southern parts of the country. However, the eastern parts, there were significant disruptions. In the northeastern areas, after the Russians were driven off the Ukrainian land there and the mining process was completed, then those lands have returned back to normal, frankly. So really, it's really been the infrastructure damage that's been critical within the country.
John, I think the message seems to be just a little more positive than when we last spoke to you 2 or 3 weeks back, when you were really concerned, I think, what the impact was going to be on the ability of farmers to plant. What are you feeling in terms of the ability to harvest over the next few months, given the direction that the war is taking?
I think that the biggest issue at present for harvest is storage, and another thing is the availability of fuel. Fuel is still short in the country. Farmers are worried about this. The key two issues that farmers, mid-sized SME farmers, are worried about is where they're going to store their grains and how they're going to take the crops off if they can't get readily available diesel. That's the biggest problem.
And any indication at this stage that there might be external assistance? I mean, obviously, we've seen other countries step up when it comes to supplying defensive military hardware. Is there at this point any communication that you're getting or having about the supply of diesel and other logistical equipment that would facilitate the harvesting and the passage of this grain out of the country?
Yeah, no question. The EU Commission has had an enormous amount of focus on this at present. Over the last week, they've mentioned a large number of initiatives to try and free up the trade across the border. I think what they're trying to do is almost double the amount of soft commodities moving across the borders. That's the first thing, and I am absolutely sure there are key initiatives in place to be able to increase fuel availability. So I think that, again, the question is, as the central bank governor said, the biggest issue is logistics. I still can't see that even if we have a normal season, which of course is not going to be normal, how do we get the product out of the country? That is the critical thing. And if we don't, how do we store it? And the storage of grains is not an easy thing, especially if the grains are wet. It's a tricky issue. So the farmers have to make a critical decision right now of whether they're going to harvest towards the end of the summer season or whether they're not, and where they're going to store it if we have an acute shortage of the supply of the silos that are necessary to hold it for a long period of time while we get it across the border.
John, as you take a look at your own situation, but also global events here, we've got this export ban on Indian wheat, concerns around the climate change in other parts of the world impacting harvests as well. How unusual is the trading pattern that we're seeing in wheat futures at this stage, and what do you believe it's going to take to try and change the pricing action in what seems to be a very volatile period now?
Look, frankly, I've been in agribusiness all my life, either with privately in this capacity or with development finance institutions. I've never seen anything like this. We have COVID, we've got a war, We've got the China COVID zero policy, which has made freight just about impossible. And we've got climate change. And all this has compounded, frankly, into a non-functional global supply chain system. And this leads to local countries being particularly worried about food security, which then leads to a cascade of export bans. And this just compounds the whole problem. That's why I believe at present that the old thesis of globalisation of food production in the most economic parts of the world and in export, I believe that's broken for the future.